Hello, my name is Jessica Van Hattem. I am known as Zara in the SCA, and this class is identifying and addressing cultural appropriation. So if you want more information about this after the class, I will have my email available. Before we get started, I do want to just go ahead and say that we are going to be using some ever-evolving terms here about potentially very sensitive subjects. So this can ruffle some feathers. I know that conversations about this already have, especially in communities like ours, historical recreation societies, and just historical costuming in general. I really want to challenge folks to keep an open mind, engage with the discussion, accept that some of the terms you hear will be new to you and some of the terms will be a little bit different, and honestly that they can continue to change over time. So to lay out how we're going to move through the class, for the first few minutes, I want to talk about what cultural appropriation is to give us all the same working definition. We can talk about what makes it different than something like cultural assimilation, exchange, or appreciation, and what makes appropriation so damaging, particularly to minority communities. This is just basics. Think of this as a 101 to familiarize yourself with the terms being used in the greater societal discussion. This topic is much bigger than just this one class. It's bigger than a track of classes. The first part will be couched in a modern perspective because we all kind of play the same costuming game across different hobby organizations, but we are products of modern society. So I want us to reach understanding on that level. So let's jump right into it. There is a very general definition of cultural appropriation that floats around, and I think that it confuses a lot of folks, and that is just when somebody adopts aspects of a culture that is not their own. This is incredibly broad, it's very generic, and it becomes very hard to pin down when you live in a country like the US that fundamentally prides itself on being a mixture of cultures. And you play in a historical costuming club that explores many cultures, your own and others. This also creates a question of what it means to adopt aspects of a culture. If I make lengua tacos for dinner tonight, am I appropriating? What if I wear a Celtic cross? What about a hanfu or a kimono? What if I write a haiku or buy traditional African fabrics? The definition is not good. It's non-specific, it's messy, and it applies to the vast majority of the population. And that's really bad because it makes it easy to downplay how damaging cultural appropriation can be. If everyone is appropriating all of the time, then it can't be that bad, right? So we're not going to use that definition. We are going to get a lot more nuanced. When we talk about problematic cultural appropriation, what we mean is really misappropriation, and it's related to power dynamics. So the working definition is when members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group for profit, whether social or financial, or to the detriment of the second culture. And I know that's a lot, so we'll unpack it. The term dominant culture can shift depending on where you are, but mostly what you're doing is you're looking at the historical context in addition to actual geographic location. I might use majority and dominant interchangeably, but I'm usually not referring to numbers. I'm referring to those power structures. When we talk about the word elements, this can be as direct as clothing or food, recipes, or as indirect as inspired fashion or hairstyles. There isn't really a hard and fast rule. What makes something appropriation is usually not a bolded, clear line. Sometimes, but usually not. Usually it is kind of a thin gray line that bends and loops and wiggles, and sometimes we don't really see it all until much later. But there are a lot of opportunities to explore and learn about other cultures, even as a member of a dominant culture, and none of them are appropriative. You are probably already engaging in some of those ways yourself. So let's talk about them. Cultural exchange can occur when a participant is invited into a culture and humbly and respectfully participates within the given framework. Let's take, as an example, a wedding in which a European American groom is marrying an Ethiopian bride. The ceremony might begin with both participants in traditional Western wedding clothes, but midway through, they step out to change into fairly traditional Ethiopian garments. Maybe they say a short piece about the significance of their outfit change and what each outfit means to their guests before or after the ceremony. At no point in this scenario is anyone mocking the cultures that are represented. Both the bride and the groom have invited the other to participate within their respective culture in this way, and they're mindful of the significance of that invitation. The audience has also been invited to the ceremony explicitly, so this is not appropriation. Closely related, sometimes interchangeably so, is the term cultural appreciation. Appreciation doesn't always involve taking elements of a culture for your own. It might be limited to just study and research. So let's say you are a graduate student pursuing your master's in Taishou era Japanese lit. You read and write 50 pages on Akutagawa's In a Grove, exploring his use of unreliable narration compared to Dostoevsky. You explore the film Rashomon and how faithful it was to the source material. You look at the influence of Edgar Allan Poe on anti-naturalism and the rise of Japanese detective style novels, and you name drop more literary terms. I don't know. The point is that through all of this, you are completely transparent in your study of Japanese literature. You at no point hide your sources. Your arguments are based on existent works that you always cite, and your thoughts reference your inspirations. The link between you and the culture that you're exploring is apparent and undeniable. Personally, I find that the common thread here is respect. A respectful, honest engagement with another culture, no matter your personal position, is necessary for a non-appropriative effort. So let's take a look at cultural assimilation, which is quite a different thing than appreciation or exchange. Assimilation has a lot to do with who is doing it and why they're doing it. So assimilation often refers to minorities taking on or giving up cultural characteristics out of survival or necessity. We do live in a society that subjectively values certain traits differently than others. And sometimes those traits are things integral to a culture, like their food or their fashion. But in some cases, this value hierarchy means that cultural groups are all but forced to abandon elements of their own cultures. So I'm going to read you a couple of short excerpts from pieces by Asian American authors describing their experiences around cultural food as children. Author Ruth Tam writes in a piece in the Washington Post, "My childhood home in suburban Chicago always smelled like whatever we were cooking. Visiting us meant cloaking yourself in the scent of hamdan juyokbang, a dish of steamed pork and salted egg, or the perfume of mapodufu, tofu and minced pork with a spicy chili and fermented black bean sauce. I didn't mind the smells growing up because I wasn't aware of them. That is, until a high school friend declared that my house smelled of Chinese grossness. The comment clung to me like the smell in my home. My hunger for my family's food was overpowered by my desire to fit in, so I minimized Chinese food's role in my life and learned how to make pasta instead." Meng Chi, a Korean chef and YouTube star living in New York City, also writes of a similar experience in her own life. "I remember boiling my Korean soup soy sauce when I lived in Missouri, and my apartment manager knocked on my door. 'What's that smell?' I got a complaint from your neighbor. I was so embarrassed that I didn't make soup soy sauce again for a long time, even after I moved back to Korea. So in both of these cases, embarrassment and shame caused these women to let go of an element of their culture that they loved. And this is far from a unique experience. You'll see this again and again in the stories of members of non-dominant cultural groups in pop culture everywhere. Uh, there's a show called Fresh Off the Boat, and there's a line where the young boy in the family relays a story his classmate called his noodle lunch worms and then demanded that he be packed a white people lunch. And this isn't just about food. Piercings and tattoos, often used to signify status or growth or achievement in other cultures, might hinder a job hunt here. Religious coverings may create suspicion or draw unwanted attention. I spent years straightening my own hair before job interviews because I had heard so many comments about my natural hairstyle, which is very curly, looking unprofessional, not tidy, not neat enough. But that's its natural state, and there's nothing inherently unprofessional about it. This is what cultural assimilation is. You might see arguments like these, Black people imitating white hairstyles, as examples of reverse appropriation. But there's no such thing. When white hairstyles are the only generally acceptable route, it's less of a preference and more of a necessity. If you need the job, you do what you need to do to get the job. Marginalized groups don't have the luxury of ignoring subjective preferences set by the dominant culture. This is where I really want to start looking at that profit or detriment portion of our working definition. So let's go back to that very quickly. Cultural appropriation is when members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group for profit, whether social or financial, or to the detriment of the second culture. So looking at that second half of that definition, let's talk about why cultural appropriation is so harmful. It encourages people to take bites of a culture without ever needing to engage with the meal. A taste of something doesn't make you an expert. You'll find folks knowing what a dream catcher is and beginning to appropriate Indigenous culture without ever studying or acknowledging the hardships and oppression that Indigenous cultures have and still do face in this country historically. Cultural appropriation allows people to effectively ignore that historical oppression. If we rewrite the story around a culture, then we create false narratives and we perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Let's go for another example. The Disney movie Pocahontas. It is wildly inaccurate. And the historical Pocahontas was paraded around as a civilized savage and died barely out of her teens. But the myth is all that people know. And lest we blame only Disney, that myth predated the movie. So this was a problem before it was a collection of show tunes. Memoirs of a Geisha is another example of media that has really defined people's understanding of a culture. The book was a work of fiction written by Arthur Goldman, who is a white man born in Tennessee. He claims to have sourced some of the material for his book from interviews with different geisha, including Mineko Iwasaki. But she and others have vocally objected to the way the book and later the film represents geisha culture. They felt that the story of their lives and profession had been twisted and exoticized because it would sell the story better. Cultural appropriation divorces source material from its originators. Rock and roll, yoga, even something like quinoa. Most people are not able to accurately identify the source of these various items, but all originated with people of color. And indeed, often those same minority cultures lose the opportunity to benefit from their creations. And that's because cultural appropriation makes it permissible for the dominant group to practice and benefit from an element of a marginalized culture that they might not even be able to claim for themselves. I want to go back to one of the authors that I have referenced earlier, Ruth Tam. She goes on to talk about the way that Cantonese foods appeared later in her life. And I'll read another short excerpt here. Little did I know that Americans would come to embrace the dishes and cooking styles that once mortified me. The Cantonese foods of my childhood have reappeared in trendy restaurants that fill their menus with perfectly plated fine dining versions of our traditional cuisine. In some cases, this shift has been heartening, but in too many others, the trend has reduced staples of our culture to fleeting fetishes. And again, it is more than just food. The perm craze of the 80s mimicked the height and texture of African hair without ever acknowledging the similarity. And in the modern day, we have fashion designers and models wearing cornrows and locks and being admired as high fashion or cutting edge. But there are members of the Black community who would be judged in certain environments for having these, despite them being ideal hairstyles for the hair textures that they have. These appropriative behaviors have ramifications much more pronounced than many people suspect. So with that said, I do want to start to wrap up with some final thoughts. Appropriation is no substitute for diversity. If you are trying to actively avoid it, when possible, elevate awareness of the cultures that you are researching or representing. Don't just create Peruvian-inspired art. Highlight Peruvian traditional artists. Don't focus a line on Mexican ponchos. Feature a Mexican designer. Use your knowledge and your platform to promote those in the culture that you are learning about, and give credit whenever possible. This is incredibly important to do no matter what, but it's so much more important when the sources that you learned from might be unknown or harder to find or hidden behind translations for many. And speaking of, secondary research is great, but primary sources are often preferable. If you have an opportunity to engage with a primary source, whether it's an interview, a history book written by a member of that culture, take it. This brings visibility to your source, and it ensures a more direct engagement with the culture itself. There isn't anything wrong with secondary sources or even tertiary sources. If all you can find is a translation of a translation or a review by an art critic, take it by all means. But keep in mind that messages can change with every interpretation. And whoever is doing that translating or doing that kind of reiteration is going to be putting their own thoughts on top of it. Remember, you are responsible for your own actions. Try not to jump to the defensive immediately if you find yourself behaving in a way that's appropriative. You want to react productively, so don't grab your toys and storm home. Apologize, acknowledge the mistake, start thinking about how to do better. You can always take a step back, do more research if you need to. No one ever made things worse by doing more research. We are all learning together, and there's no shame in being wrong sometimes. So at this point, we have established a working definition. We've identified the differences between appropriation, exchange, appreciation, and assimilation. And we know why cultural appropriation is so harmful. As costuming groups and other groups like the SCA become progressively more inclusive of worldwide cultures, we want to keep encouraging people to explore cultures that aren't their own. Cultural appropriation is one of the unfortunate pitfalls that we might fall into if we don't walk this path with open eyes. We have to be mindful of modern history and its effects in our respective organizations. This is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. This is a very complicated issue that includes our histories, our state of affairs, and our future, as we act to eliminate oppression instead of perpetuating it. Again, please do reach out via email if you need any more information or have any questions, and I am happy to help. Thank you so much. Enjoy the event.